Hello and welcome to the Bearded Tits podcast. I'm your host Jack Perks, and in today's podcast we're going to be looking at prints. Are they still relevant? It's changed a lot in recent years. So to answer these questions, I'm talking to Vince Cater from Fotospeed. They are a photo paper company, and we had a good chat with Vince. He was saying how the print labs have largely closed, but there's been an increase in sales, although much smaller, because obviously people are revisiting hard drives and they're finding prints that they want to print. So it's weird how, even though some aspects are struggling, other aspects during this challenging time are working pretty well. I talked to Vince a little bit about how the industry's changed. Is there still a place for prints? And he also tells me a little bit how to make money from prints, because I don't sell many prints myself due to the specialist nature of what I take, but he was telling me some tips on how to actually bump up that value of print. So this is Vince Cater and me. So thanks for joining me, Vince. You work for Fotospeed. So firstly, who are Fotospeed and what is it that you do there?
So Fotospeed is an inkjet paper supplies company, but actually it started off in '89. So originally it was a darkroom chemistry and darkroom paper supplies company. And we were, I guess, kind of moving along quite nicely. And then with the explosion of digital in the late '90s, we jumped on that ship and started releasing our own digital inkjet papers, which is what we're mainly known for now. So I think we had about 10 papers at the time. We've now got around about 34 different inkjet papers, so a huge range of different inkjet papers. But we're also, I guess, quite well known for our support with colour management and making sure we get the most from the papers.
Yeah, so, because if you think, well, when a lot of people think about printing in general, if you wind the clock back 20 or so years, it was a necessity of photography. If you wanted to see what your image looked like, you had to print it out. But you fast forward to now, and I guess it's fair to say not as many photographers print their images. So is there still a place for prints in modern photography?
Oh, certainly. I guess I'll start with your first point. You had to print originally, so I was quite lucky that we had a darkroom at home. So I used to go out with my father, shoot film, come back home, develop the film, and then see the magic of the image appearing in the developing tray, which obviously we don't have so much now. There's kind of that instantaneous need now because we're shooting digital, so we can go out and shoot the picture and we can see what it looks like straight away on the back of the camera, and you can even Wi-Fi it from your camera to your mobile phone and upload it on social media. So a big part of what it's about now is social media, I guess, the need for likes and shares and things like that. But there's certainly still a place for printing. I mean, if you hold a print in your hand, nothing beats it. There's that tactile nature to having a print in your hand, that wow factor. I mean, if you think about the native resolution of an SLR camera now, it could be as much as sort of 50 megapixel, maybe more. I know the phase systems are up to 150 megapixel. So the native resolution is as big as an A0 print. It kind of seems unnecessary just to have it for a mobile phone or an iPad. Why not print it big? That's what it's meant for. What's the point in having a big resolution camera if you're not printing it?
Yeah, it's kind of overkill in a way, isn't it? When most people are just going to upload it to Instagram or Twitter or whatever.
It's quite disappointing, really. I mean, they're taking this incredible picture, they're showing it on Instagram for that instant gratification likes and shares and comments, and then the picture's forgotten about. You hear it, well, right about now, obviously, with what's going on, people are going back to those files and processing and realising actually how many good pictures they had that were completely forgotten about. But again, so when people print it, I think there's just so much more you get from a print than you do from an LCD computer screen or a mobile phone. You don't really have much control over a mobile phone. They all look kind of different, whereas a print, you have control over that.
You've got that tangibility with a print as well. Like you can pick it up and there's more of I guess it's kind of getting a bit arty now, but more of a connection to it because you pick it up, you see it, and it's the final product as well. Like if it's on the computer, you can keep tweaking with it, and you might be like, well, it's not quite done. But when you've printed, you've committed to that image. That's it. It's done. You know, you're happy with it. Hopefully, you're happy with it. But.
Yeah, well, I don't think it's a photograph until it's printed. I know Charlie Waite talks a lot about this. So
yeah, I like that quote.
It isn't, is it, really? I mean, a photograph, it's something physical in your hand. and it's what it's all about for me. But I mean, it is nice sharing it with people, and actually social media does have a place for obvious reasons right about now. It gets your work out there to a lot more people. It just looks so much better on the wall, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, I learned in a dark room on black and white film more years ago than I care to remember now, really. But paper choice was so important for highlighting the qualities in certain images. You know, for gloss for rich colours, matte for contrast. And it's a shame that in a way people are, I don't know if forgetting's the right word, but they're just not using it as much as maybe they would have. And it is a shame, really.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the range of papers in the darkroom days were, I guess, fairly minimal. So you had your everyday sort of resin-coated oyster and gloss, and then you had the real nice, beautiful fibre-based papers where you get, like you said, the deep blacks, the real crispy deep blacks that you probably wouldn't get from an everyday resin-coated paper. And that's much the same with our inkjet range of papers. I mean, you've got your everyday papers, such as your lustres and your glosses, but when you're putting it on a fine art Barita style paper or a fine art matte paper, you start to get more detail from the image. You're getting deeper blacks, brighter whites, punchier colours. Then obviously you can look at textured finishes, smooth finishes. They all have their own place for certain kinds of images. I mean, you'll know that when we've sent prints to you of your work, it really works getting it on a nice paper that suits that file.
So has digital, in a way, opened up more options with papers, though? Because you were saying that with the old days it was relatively limited. So are there more options now with papers?
Yeah, certainly, because the process of coating an inkjet paper is actually taking, in many cases, a fine art paper. So if you've heard of the mills such as Hanemüller, Canson, Somerset, they are traditionally art mills. So they're producing artist papers for painters, artists. And all we're doing is working with a mill to get the art paper, and then an ink receiving layer is then put onto the paper, which allows you to print straight onto an art paper. So there's much more opportunities now with inkjet papers as opposed to darkroom papers. The range and options are endless, really.
So is it fair to say that prints are more of a fine art thing now, or like where do they kind of fit in, I guess?
I don't think so. I think it's accessible to everyone. I mean, you can obviously pick up a little A4 printer, and the quality is, for colour printing, is actually okay. But I don't think it's until you get to an A3 plus type printer that you're going to get the quality. But I think it's accessible to everyone. So if you look at the quality of an iPhone now, you can get an A3 print from it. So I don't think it should stop people from printing it at all.
Well, and that'll be, sorry, that'll be pretty decent quality, will it? So you get an A3 print from a little tiny iPhone will produce some.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, really? The latest iPhone cameras, they're 12 megapixel. They're decent sensors now as well. I mean, I've produced A3 prints from them. There's a photographer, Mark Littlejohn, actually. So, as you're probably aware, the photography show was delayed, so we'd actually ran a whole series of iPhone prints for Mark, and they look brilliant. They look really good. And it's not until you start bringing it really close to your eye that you see maybe areas breaking up slightly. We say if you're looking at a piece of art, you shouldn't look at it any closer than the diagonal of the paper. So that should be the distance you look at it from. But that's never the case, is it? We're always going.
Well, yeah, I suppose you'd hope most people aren't going to have the magnifying glass and kind of getting in there. But yeah, you're normally stood a metre or so away, aren't you? And you can appreciate it.
A decent distance.
Yeah.
So yeah, you can print decent files from your iPhone. And again, even with an iPhone picture, the papers do make a difference. So picking the right paper for the image is crucial.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, when I first started photography a few years ago, one of the best pieces of advice I was told was surround yourself with your successors. And it sounds a little bit narcissistic, but to put some of your best images on the wall, because it just reminds you, I think all photographers go through, I call it the photography blues, but maybe where you just have a little lull in creativity or whatever. And I think sometimes just having those images on the wall, they just pick you up a little bit. It's not the same as looking at on your phone or on your screen. When it's physically there, you know, maybe 4 or 5 of your best pictures, It doesn't have to be kind of all over the place. Maybe just in an office or in your toilet, I don't know, somewhere in the house, just to kind of pick you up. And I think it does help to see them out there, to see your pictures in tangible, like, be able to physically look at them and see them.
But also as a printer, you can regularly change it yourself as well. So if it's your own work, like you say, you should have your own work up. Why not celebrate all that hard work you've gone to? It seems kind of a waste sat on the hard drive. So yeah, have your good work sat around. But also when you make a print, I guess our emotions can affect how we process an image as well for printing purposes. So sometimes it's worth making a print, leaving it around the house, and for a period of time, keep walking past it. Make sure you're happy with it before you put it in the frame. But also having other people's work up as well. I think that's quite nice. It sort of inspires you at the same time.
Yeah, I think a lot of photographers, or certainly a lot of the photographers I've come into contact with, can be a little bit hesitant to do that. I don't know whether it's because, I don't know why it is, because I'd never think to have another photographer on my wall. I've got art on my wall, got artists, which I suppose I draw inspiration from, but I don't know why that is. It's not because, I don't know. It's a weird thing, really. I can't really think why I wouldn't want someone else's images. Maybe if they were an inspiration. I've got books. I've got photography books which I look at, but I see your point. I see what you're saying.
It could be a community thing. I know on sort of Twitter and places like they have what's called a print swap. So obviously every print has a different value, a perceived value, depending on the photographer. Like an artist, really. Different prints can go for different values of money. I know of sort of A1 print selling for £10,000 at a time and others selling for £100 at a time. It just depends on your perceived value. But a lot of photographers do what's called a print swap. So rather than having to lay out X amount of money for a print, they'll swap one of their own prints for one of their favourite photographer's prints. And they'll pick one each. All being well, they both like each other's prints. And then I put them on the wall.
No, that's I've not come across that, but that's a really nice idea. Actually, I quite like the idea of that. And it reminds me, I can't remember the name of the photographer, but wasn't the most expensive print ever? Was it a sunset or something, like a blurry sunset, and it went for over $1 million, or it was about $1 million?
Is that Peter Lick?
Quite possibly. You probably know better than me, but I seem to, because it wasn't that long ago, was it? Was it a couple of years ago or something?
Yeah. I mean, there's a whole story around it. I mean, I could be completely wrong. But the story that I hear is that he had someone buy it for himself. So no money was actually exchanged hands. So it went for £1 million, but it's a whole interesting story about that.
We're getting all the gossip now, Vince. That's really interesting too. Really interesting to know that.
That didn't come from me, by the way.
Yeah. Allegedly.
That's what I hear. Yeah. That's what the rumours are. But it's interesting perceived value, isn't it? Because again, I know of another photographer that had their work up in an exhibition setting, and they were valuing him at one price. Someone else looked at them and said, "No, add a zero on the end." And their work was up with other photographers, and all the prints that had the extra zero on the end were the bigger selling prints, because people like the idea of laying out larger sums of money to tell their friends they've bought that very expensive print.
It is. I've always, because I do sell a few prints, but I don't make a huge amount of money from prints myself. I guess that's because the nature of my work is quite specialist. Like, unless you're a very keen angler, you're probably not going to have a roach. I mean, you might have a roach on your wall because I know you're quite a keen angler, but most other people probably wouldn't. But
That's true.
But I've always struggled to know what to price it at, because I look at, there doesn't seem to be a system. Like, you see some photographers and they'll sell their prints for, I don't know, a 10x8 for a tenner, and then someone else might sell it for 50 quid. And it's difficult pricing stuff like that, I found personally.
Okay. I definitely agree. I mean, you should never start too cheap. I think the problem is if you start your print at a very low value, it's hard then to increase it. But there are ways of increasing your value, and that's so things like limited edition runs. So a lot of photographers we work with will release their print on a limited edition run. It could be 15, it could be 50, it could be 150. But obviously the smaller the print run, the higher the value. And as they sell through, when there's only a couple left of that print run, the value increases sharply. So again, another print run that started off at £500 and the last two were selling for £7,000 each.
Wow.
So that's a good way of adding value to your print runs. I think if it's an open range, people don't expect to pay large sums of money for it.
I mean, so I've not. Well, I know artists do that with prints, but I guess photographers are artists, arguably. But I'd never really thought of doing that. That's a really good point, actually. So maybe I'll, 5 roach prints and just see how that goes.
Yeah, I think it's putting a story behind the print run as well, isn't it? It's putting it on the right paper. So if you're putting it on an art paper, it kind of adds value to it straight away, as it's considered giclé. So have you heard of the phrase giclé?
I've not come across that.
So giclé goes back to the sort of late 80s, early 90s. A couple of photographers, Jack Dugan, and a very well-known musician. Have you heard of the band Crosby, Stills and Nash? Or Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young?
It rings a bell, but I couldn't name a song.
Okay, well, there's a well-known song called Our House. You have a little listen later, you'll know it. Okay. So they were kind of a cappella, they were singers, and they sang with Neil Young as well. You heard of Neil Young, I'm guessing.
I know, yeah.
Okay, so Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, that was another formation of them. Okay. So Graham Nash is a keen photographer as well, a very keen photographer, and they wanted to devise a plan to add value to prints because it was called inkjet printing and it sounded quite boring, really. There was no art surrounding it, so they coined this phrase a giclé print, which meant it was archival and on a paper that had at least 25% cotton rag content, I think it was at the time. But ironically, giclé just means little squirts. So it's down to the small dots going down, things like that. But giclé adds a value to your work. So if it's on a fine art paper, it's used pigment ink. Pigment ink is obviously archival ink. Then it will last and stand the test of time. So if you look at dye ink versus pigment ink, if you were to print something on a cheap printer with dye ink and put a piece of paper over it and leave it in your car window, it will fade as quickly as a couple of days. It'll start fading. Whereas a pigment is a ground mineral suspended in liquid. It won't fade. It will just last at least our lifetime, maybe a couple more.
So that's really interesting. And I guess as well, if it is a limited edition, it kind of adds something to the buyer as well. It's not like, oh, there's 1,000 of these out there. It's like, I've got one of, 5, 10, 15, whatever. It's a bit more special, I suppose.
Oh, very much so. Yeah, it's the same as a piece, I guess an original piece of art in terms of painting, we can't really replicate because that is a one-off and then it can be scanned and printed, limited edition runs from that. Whereas a photograph, I guess the original file is the raw file, if we're shooting raw. That is the piece of art, but there's no value to the digital file necessarily, whereas the print form, when we're selling it, seems to have the value. But I guess it then goes back to the requirement for the file. I mean, if you're working for an agency in model photography and things like that, the digital file is the value. Whereas if you're a landscape photographer and you're selling your work, the print seems to have that value a little more.
So you see a lot of misinformation online about colour management, Vince. Can you kind of clear the air a little bit about that?
I can certainly try. I mean, something we pride ourselves on is the technical support, because there are a lot of people out there selling paper. There's probably hundreds of different brands out there, and we have a full tech support team that can support you through and hold your hand through the process. So you have something called a custom profiling service. So if you go back to the old days of custom profiling, for a profile it would cost around about £1,000. So a profile will tell, it's a huge amount of money, so a profile will tell the printer what colours to put down. And to get a profile made, we supply like a coloured test chart to the photographer or the printer, and they will print it out onto the different papers that they use. So the crucial part is with printing is that every single paper interprets information slightly differently. Every single printer interprets information slightly differently. And every monitor and computer interprets information slightly differently. So there's this whole battle in how to get it all singing off the same hymn sheet. So the first part is the paper profiling, and you print off this test chart onto the different papers, and you then send it to us at Fotospeed, and we use something called a spectrophotometer. It's a bit of a mouthful. And the spectrophotometer will read every single coloured square on that test chart printed on the paper as a number, and it will compare it up against what it should be producing, and from that it will make a paper profile, and that will tell the printer what to do effectively. I said every print is slightly different. Even the same model will interpret information differently. That's why it's so crucial. Much like a camera, if you're to buy 10 of the same camera, they'll all take the information in very slightly differently.
So there's a lot of variables then. So obviously you
So
want to...
Yeah, so much variation. I mean, the monitors as well. So every monitor is slightly different, so you need to get it calibrated, so you've got everything working as it should.
Yeah, I mean, I know when I've sent you guys prints, they've definitely come back looking better than what I sent them to you, definitely. So you're doing something right.
So that might suggest your monitor's not quite right, not quite calibrated.
That probably sounds about right. Well, that's the excuse I'll use when I post something and the colours look a bit off anyway.
yeah, exactly.
Well, look, Vince, it's been great talking to you. Fascinating to learn a little bit more about prints. So thanks for joining me.
No, my absolute pleasure, Jack. Take care, yeah?
Cheers, you too. So that was Vince Cater talking about prints. And that brings us nicely onto Nature Reserve of the Week. And this week it's Loch Garten. It's a nature reserve located in the Cairngorms National Park, surrounded by ancient Caledonian forest. And it really is like taking a step back in time. You can just stand there and the smell of lichen and moss in the air and imagine a few hundred years ago wolves and bears prowling around. Now, Abernethy is actually the second largest RSPB reserve, which includes Loch Garten. There's a basic visitor centre there. You know, you can go in, there's a coffee machine and a few bits and bobs to buy, but there's no cafe or anything like that. There's a pretty big car park. You don't have to pay to go in the car park. And there's also a lot more like as you come in, which has another little car park. You can go in there. There's lots of viewing points that you can go as you go around the loch and into the woodland. And there's also some toilets at the visitor centre. However, this is only open from April to September, so all these services are kind of shut off after that. So if you're there in the winter, you're going to have to find a good looking tree. They have feeders set up near the centre which regularly attract red squirrels and a whole host of woodland birds like tree creepers, great tits, greater spotted woodpecker and some very, very friendly coal tits which actually feed out your hand. It's one of the most magical things you can do when you're up in the Highlands connecting with nature. Arguably, though, the star attraction of this reserve is the crested tit, which is one of the only places you can find them with any certainty around the Cairngorms National Park. It has a bit of a reputation for people putting sticks out on benches and things like that. So if you see a crested tit sat on a clean backdrop with a licheny stick, it's almost certainly at Loch Garten. Not saying there's anything wrong with that, but you pretty much know where it was taken. Now, in the 1950s, osprey also returned to breed at Loch Garten after dying out in Britain. And in the summer, you get a great chance of seeing them flying around the reserve and on the nest. And they even have a webcam set up there as well. So if you're in the Cairngorms, Loch Garten is an absolute must. It can get quite busy, even in the winter it gets busy with photographers, but that shouldn't put you off to go and see that. Well, I hope you've enjoyed today's podcast. I personally say I don't sell that many prints, but it's always nice when one does go out. And I agree with Vince that there is still a place in printing in photography. So why not print some of your prints out? Have a good look. Try and get a new feel for them. Particularly if you've never printed a print before, it does open up a whole new world to do that. So until the next podcast, I'll catch you next time. Thanks for listening. Cheers.